Rain has a way of softening the world, but on this night at Royal Lodge, it only sharpened the silence. Behind a window traced with cold streaks of November weather, Sarah Ferguson sat alone at her desk, a silhouette shaped by resolve rather than ease, preparing to make a decision that would ripple far beyond the room she occupied. For decades, she has lived between scrutiny and survival. A duchess without the shield of a title, a mother navigating a life where affection is private, but judgment is public. She has learned to rebuild with a kind of stubborn grace. To Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie, she was never the headline. She was the refuge behind it. The warm voice at the end of long days. The steady presence when royal life felt more performance than home. Yet when Fergie agreed to a $1.5 million commitment, part financial necessity, part unwavering loyalty to someone she once trusted, part the difficult arithmetic of a life entangled with the monarchy, the act disturbed the fragile harmony she had spent years repairing. It was not reckless nor dishonest. It was something far more human. A choice made under pressure, carrying consequences she could not fully control. Her daughters recognised the motivation, but the weight of it unsettled them. Observers across Britain felt a familiar question return. Why does a woman who has endured so much still find herself drawn towards decisions that threaten her peace? And so the contradiction emerges, quiet, dignified, unresolved. In a family where reputation is inherited, but redemption must be earned, even a mother's signature can ignite the echoes she hoped had long faded. There is a certain irony in the way some public figures recover from scandal. Many withdraw, settling into a life of comfortable distance, content to let memory fade. Sarah Ferguson chose the opposite path. In the quiet years after the early 90s controversies, she did not retreat from view. She rebuilt her identity in full daylight, one piece at a time, as if refusing to be defined by the worst moments of her past. Writing became her first bridge back to the public. Memoirs that spoke candidly of upheaval and resilience. Children's books that carried warmth, humour and imagination. These works softened her image, reminding Britain that behind the headlines was a woman capable of honesty and creative charm. Her voice, sometimes self-deprecating, sometimes surprisingly serious, helped her occupy a space few former royals had managed to claim. Approachable, flawed, unmistakably human. Philanthropy followed with similar resolve. She immersed herself in causes linked to health, children's welfare and literacy, using her visibility not as a shield, but as a tool. Charities found in her an advocate who understood vulnerability, and audiences responded to the sincerity she brought to her work. In a royal world often associated with distance, her warmth became her quiet rebellion. Across the Atlantic, she found yet another chapter. In the United States, she spoke openly about recovery, financial strain, emotional well-being, subjects rarely associated with the monarchy's polished veneer. Americans, less restrained by traditional deference, embraced her willingness to discuss struggle as part of a larger journey towards self-worth. In this space, she became not a former duchess, but a woman whose lessons were earned rather than inherited. All the while, her daughters watched this reinvention unfold not through newspapers, but in the everyday rhythm of home life. They saw the effort behind the appearances, the long hours writing, the anxious preparation before interviews, the determination to maintain stability despite uncertainty. For Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie, their mother's story was not a public narrative of recovery. It was a private study in perseverance. Gradually, the world responded. Fergie's return to certain royal events was cautious but genuine. The formality of the institution may never have fully opened its doors to her again, yet her presence was no longer unwelcome. The trio she formed with her daughters became a rare example of emotional closeness within a family more accustomed to ceremony than intimacy. But reinvention, however admirable, has its limits. Beneath the optimism remained a financial fragility she could not entirely disguise. Her public image, though much improved, was still vulnerable to the shadows of past associations. And her life, however independently she lived it, continued to intersect with Prince Andrew's, a connection that carried both affection and unavoidable consequence. Her daughters believed she had rebuilt herself. They were right. What they could not yet see was how delicate that reconstruction truly was. A life strengthened by resilience, yet still resting on foundations that trembled when tested. In public, Sarah Ferguson often radiated an openness that felt almost disarming. The bright laugh, the quick warmth, the instinct to make others comfortable. Yet behind that familiarity lay a private landscape far more complex. shaped by debts, expectations, and loyalties that never fully loosened their grip. Her reinvention may have softened the headlines, but it did not quiet the pressures that gathered in the quieter corners of her life. Royal Lodge, the sprawling residence she continued to share with Prince Andrew long after their marriage ended, embodied this contradiction. To the outside world, it appeared a symbol of unity, a reminder that family could transcend formality. But within its long corridors and ageing timbers, it carried a different weight. Maintaining a royal-adjacent home was a responsibility that demanded resources far beyond what her philanthropic roles or writing career could provide. It was sanctuary, yes, but also obligation. Its very existence dependent on costs she struggled to meet. Financial strain was not new to her. Reports over the years had hinted at debts accumulated through business ventures that faltered, or lifestyle expectations that clung to her despite her non-royal status. She worked, she earned, she persevered. But the gap between public visibility and private sustainability never truly closed. Her daughters, protective and loyal, stood beside her with affection rather than judgment. Yet they could not shoulder the structural demands of the life their mother maintained. And then there was Andrew. His presence remained a constant, sometimes supportive, sometimes shadowed by controversy, always entwined with her own story. Their post-divorce relationship, unconventional but undeniably affectionate, created an emotional bond that blurred the lines between past and present. When he faced intensifying legal and financial pressures, that bond transformed into a new form of responsibility. Fergie was not his wife, but she was still part of his world, and he of hers. The $1.5 million decision did not emerge from ambition, extravagance, or personal gain. It grew from a quieter fear, the sense that the home she cherished, the last space where her fractured family still gathered as something resembling whole, might be lost. Royal Lodge was more than bricks and beams. It was continuity for her daughters, a place whose calm allowed them to escape the noise of public life. Losing it would mean dismantling the final refuge she had fought to protect. Beatrice and Eugenie sensed the tension in their mother's voice during those months. The pauses, the half-answered questions, the softening smile meant to reassure. They had watched her find solutions before, turning crises into new beginnings. But this moment felt different. The choices before her no longer offered a clean path. Every route carried risk, and every decision carved into the fragile stability she had spent decades piecing together. In the soft daylight that filters through the quiet corridors of Royal Lodge, dust often hangs in the air. Reminders of time, memory, and the stories that linger long after footsteps fade. It is in that stillness that the truth becomes unmistakable. The pressures shaping Fergie's choice were not loud or dramatic. They were intimate, unseen, and borne almost entirely in silence by the woman at the centre of them. The story did not break with drama, nor with the sharp shock of scandal. It arrived instead as a quiet but unmistakable jolt. A report that Sarah Ferguson had entered, or committed herself, to a $1.5 million financial arrangement linked to the uncertain future of Royal Lodge. The number alone was arresting. Not extravagant, not implausible, but startling in its contrast to the woman Britain believed she had become. Resourceful, cautious, painfully familiar with financial strain. The reaction across the country was not fury, it was confusion. Observers asked the same question in slightly different forms. Why would someone who had spent decades repairing her footing willingly step onto such unstable ground? And why now, at a moment when the monarchy itself was navigating one of the most delicate stretches in its modern history? For Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie, the impact was not measured in headlines, but in heartache. They knew their mother's instincts, the protective loyalty, the reflex to support those she loves, the desire to keep a fractured family intact. They had seen the toll of her past, the debt, the humiliation, the slow climb back towards dignity. This decision felt uncomfortably familiar, as though she had turned back toward a precipice she had once fought so hard to leave behind. Inside newsrooms, commentary began to sharpen. Analysts debated whether this was a gesture of devotion or an act of jeopardy. Some framed it as a rescue, a mother shielding her family's last remaining home. Others saw it as a return to old patterns, self-sacrifice masquerading as duty, generosity overshadowing prudence. And between these opposing interpretations, a quieter concern took shape. Had Fergie risked not just her finances, but the stability she had so carefully reconstructed? Journalists sought clarity, but the answers remained layered. Statements offered hints rather than explanations. Reports suggested a mixture of necessity and loyalty, though none could quite unravel the personal calculus behind the decision. What became increasingly clear, however, was that the choice had not been driven by strategy. It was shaped by the emotional architecture of Sarah Ferguson's life, the enduring loyalty to Prince Andrew, the desire to preserve a home filled with her daughter's memories, and the enduring hope that unity might outlast consequence. In one image, the moment distills itself. A fountain pen resting on a legal document, ink still glistening, the edges of the signature feathering slightly on the page. A small gesture, almost mundane, yet it carried a weight that would shift the ground beneath her feet. This was the turning point, the instant when quiet pressures became public questions and a decision meant to hold her world together instead revealed how fragile that world had always been. The consequences did not erupt, they settled. Quietly at first, almost imperceptibly, then with a clarity that left little room for denial. Once the $1.5 million decision entered public view, the atmosphere around Sarah Ferguson shifted, not in hostility, but in a kind of solemn recognition that something long feared had resurfaced. Inside the family, concern gathered swiftly. Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie, who had always stood shoulder to shoulder with both parents, felt the familiar pull of divided loyalty. They knew their mother's intentions were rooted in protection, in preserving a semblance of unity for a family that had weathered more turbulence than most. But they also remembered the years when their mother struggled under the weight of debt, criticism, and the lingering consequences of past missteps. This latest decision stirred an old unease. The worry that history was quietly looping back on itself. In private, they defended her with affection and fierce certainty. To them, she was still the anchor of their childhood, the resilient presence who navigated chaos with warmth and humour. Yet beneath that loyalty lay a quiet alarm. They feared the return of financial instability. They feared the scrutiny that would once again circle her like unwelcome weather. And they feared the emotional toll, the self-blame she rarely voiced but always carried. Within the wider royal orbit, the reaction was measured but unmistakable. Advisors, already vigilant in a period of heightened sensitivity for the monarchy, became cautious. Associations that once seemed harmless now felt laden with risk. King Charles III, aware of the personal complexities and the deep history between Fergie and Andrew, responded with the restraint expected of a sovereign. He did not intervene, nor did he condemn. Instead, a silent boundary emerged, a reminder that in a modern, scrutinised monarchy, individual decisions must be owned by those who make them. The institution moved quietly to maintain distance, not out of punishment, but preservation. For Fergie, the message was subtle yet unmistakable. The crown would not carry the consequences of her choice. In the press, responses divided along familiar lines. Some commentators saw a woman acting out of loyalty, attempting to protect the fragile remnants of her family's stability. Others framed it as part of a long narrative of financial entanglement, another instance where sentiment overrode prudence. The commentary was not cruel, but it was weary, as though the story had been told once before. For Sarah Ferguson herself, the aftermath was weighted less by public perception than by private reflection. She had acted from instinct, the instinct that family must be protected, even when the cost is personal. But as the dust settled, it became clear that the emotional burden had fallen not only on her but on her daughters, whose lives she had hoped to spare from yet another reckoning. At dusk, Windsor's lawns stretched long shadows across the ground, the light thinning into quiet, unresolved shapes. It is in that softened hour that the truth of the aftermath feels clearest. She meant well, wholeheartedly, instinctively, but the ripples of her decision travelled further than she ever intended, touching those she loved most. In the end, the story of Sarah Ferguson does not rest on a single choice, nor on any headline that fled briefly before fading into the wider tapestry of royal memory. Its weight lies instead in the sincerity that has shaped each step of her journey, the instinct to protect, the willingness to rebuild, and the resilience that has carried her through cycles of affection and judgment. Her $1.5 million decision, though startling, is not the sum of her identity. It is a reminder of how loyalty functions within the monarchy. Cherished, expected, and rarely uncomplicated. In a family where symbolism is currency, even a private act becomes a public mirror, reflecting intentions and vulnerabilities in equal measure. Fergie's choice, born not of strategy but of emotion, revealed the delicate balance between devotion and consequence that defines life at the edges of the crown. For Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie, the initial shock has eased into something softer. They know their mother's imperfections. They have watched her confront them with humility and humour. But more than anything, they know her constancy. She has never stepped away from them, even when the world stepped away from her. That truth, quietly enduring, shapes their understanding far more than any financial misjudgment could. And for Britain, Sarah Ferguson remains an unlikely but enduring figure, not simply a duchess by marriage, nor a cautionary tale, but a woman who has navigated the monarchy's long shadow with warmth, candour, and an unpolished humanity that both unsettles and endears. Her life sits at the intersection of grace and error, a reminder that redemption is rarely linear and loyalty never free of cost. As dawn light enters a quiet room, a single candle flickers, its flame steady yet delicate. It is a small image, almost fragile, yet entirely fitting. For in Fergie's flaws, as in her resilience, we glimpse something recognisable, the human struggle to do right in a world that keeps changing the terms.